This video is about realism in English and American literature. It will address realism under 5 categories: the when, the why, the how, the who, and the what pertaining to the movement. Regarding the time span of the movement, one can speak of 2 main surges, 2 phases, not one. And this is one difference between realism and many other movements, most of which refer to one specific era. The first phase came about in both England and America in the 18th century, which is referred to as the Age of Reason or the Age of the Enlightenment. The second, the more well-known perhaps, unfolded in the second half of the 19th century, in England during the Victorian era and in America after the Civil War, lasting in both till the early years of the 20th century. Obviously, as in the case of other movements, realism had many moments before the 18th century and continued as moments or aspects of other movements after the end of the 19th century. Why did realism come to the literary scene? Regarding the first phase, that of realism in the 18th century, it can be seen as part and parcel of the radical shift which brought about the Enlightenment itself in the era of the First Industrial Revolution. In this sense, realism can be considered a feature or a component of the Enlightenment, an engagement with it, and even a result. And it can also be perceived, again like the Enlightenment, as a conscious reaction against the thinking that came before. Regarding the second phase, realism emerged in the aftermath of the Romantic movement, which flourished throughout the first half of the 19th century and then declined. Realism in this period came as a natural outcome of the eventual collapse of Romanticism, as well as literary texts which came to be called romances. In this sense, it can be viewed either as a reaction against the Romantic movement and the genre of romanticization in general, or a divergence from them, reflecting the mood that prevailed in England with the advent of Victorianism and in America with the outbreak of the Civil War. In this very period, realism became a full-fledged movement. In the earlier phase, the shift toward realism is bipartite. The first part manifests itself in the radical shift from preoccupation with the metaphysical, spiritual world, which dominated prior to the 18th century, and in which religious faith was prioritized, to the physical and material, in which pragmatism, science, and reason emerged as powerful forces, replacing traditional faith and becoming the primary concern throughout the 18th century. Or we can say, the shift at this level is from concern with the heavenly and extraterrestrial to emphasis on the worldly, the earthly, and the terrestrial. Let me illustrate. Students and readers of English and American literature know very well that up to the end of the 17th century, the dominant discourse within the literary scene was the religious, reflected clearly, for example, in George Herbert's The Colour, John Donne's Holy Sonnets, Edward Taylor's Prologue, and the same tendency is also manifested in Milton's epic Paradise Lost, and in novels like Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, as well as poems by Anne Bradstreet like The Flesh and the Spirit. All of these texts and authors, and many others, stress deprivileging or renouncing concern with the physical, material, earthly world, and privileging or propagating focus on the heavenly, the spiritual, and the inner. Primary interest for people, the emphasis was, should not be in this world and in this life, but in the afterworld and the afterlife. And this, among other things, is the essence of religious faith prior to the 18th century in England and America. In 18th century realism, by contrast, the dominant discourse was the secular, the scientific, and the capitalistic, in which the primary focus started to be on the physical, material world, on this life, as well as on the self's outer condition and not so much the inner. A lot of emphasis was laid on rationalism, material wealth, commerce, inventions, technology, electricity, improvement of streets, of knowledge, of human rights, and on habits, customs, public conduct, and details of daily life. One's essential mission or calling is to improve both one's own situation in the world and one's own society. In fact, improving one inevitably leads to improving the other. Such shift is clearly epitomized, for example, in Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, where the protagonist's primary focus is on adventures that bring about wealth, belongings, and power. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which recounts Franklin's journey from anonymity and poverty to wealth and fame in the world. On Congreve's play, The Way of the World, and Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice, which tackle human relations, societal concerns, love, and marriage. One can argue, in fact, that capitalism, which enjoyed a huge popularity in the 18th century, is a product of this realistic, pragmatic thinking. The second part of the shift is from concern with the uncommon, exotic, and extraordinary themes, plots, and heroes to the common, daily, and ordinary. Those who are familiar with the English literary canon recall that the emphasis in literature prior to the 18th century, especially in epics and drama, was primarily, and with few exceptions, on the worlds, lives, adventures, achievements, or flaws of eminent individuals, mighty heroes, in fact, triumphant or tragic, kings, princes, dukes, knights, or exceptional individuals like Beowulf, King Arthur, Sir Gawain, Hamlet, Faustus, Adam and Eve in Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, Volpone, individuals who have a higher, loftier standing or status. The 18th century saw a departure from such tradition, to use a term coined by Edward Said, with a focus on the daily experiences, preoccupations, adventures, and worlds of common, ordinary people, primarily those struggling to make it in the world. People again like Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Fielding's Joseph Andrews, Sterne's Tristram Shandy, and Swift's Gulliver. They are nearly all born either poor or with limited means and struggle to survive and thrive in the world. Realistic narratives written about these protagonists and others are full of description and details of how they live and what they do. None of them is noble or of a high birth, standing, or status. They generally belong to the middle and lower classes. As for the later phase of realism, that of the second half of the 19th century, the two trends or shifts just stated continued to assert themselves. Much of the discourse continued to be secular instead of religious, and the protagonists continued to be ordinary and common as opposed to the noble and the romantic. And this is the main thrust of realism in general. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, one of the most realistic novels in the period, epitomizes these two trends: secularized, even regionalized discourse, and a common, ordinary protagonist living a common, ordinary life and struggling to survive. The reaction against romanticization, in the dual sense of both romances, stories that are romances, and romanticism, the romantic movement, is clearly reflected in the literature of the period. Whereas romances and romanticism depicted the world as it should be, where the emphasis is on individuals who do great deeds, such as in the case of romances, or on the power of the imagination transforming reality and uplifting the soul, as in the case of romanticism, realism depicted life as it is, without any embellishment or glamour. The life, in other words, of common, ordinary people doing common, ordinary things. Undoubtedly, the second phase of realism is a continuation of the first phase, as has just been underscored. In other words, very similar. However, it is also a bit different, and this difference is significant. I will dwell here on two main differences. The first is that while in the earlier phase, several literary texts, such as Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, embody success and a happy ending, most texts in the second phase, again, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn is a good example, embody either no success whatsoever, life as it is without any significant climaxes, or even utter failure. In this sense, the plot in realistic stories in the second phase takes on a more disappointing, bitter, and even sinister turn. The protagonist suffers and exerts a lot of effort, but is unable to lift himself or herself up, and therefore he or she is generally less heroic in the second phase than in the first phase. The second is that while society in the first phase did appear somewhat dysfunctional in some literary works, and did appear oppressive, such as in Swift's A Modest Proposal, it was mainly viewed as a space that could be reformed, improved, and advanced, such as in Franklin's autobiography, or much of the literature about human rights, inventions, and knowledge. There was a lot of enthusiasm about the ability to improve one's life and uplift society. In a sense, the first phase of realism is a bit more optimistic and a bit wider. In the second phase, by contrast, society is largely seen not only as incapable of being improved, but in fact as a limiting force, even an antagonist and an enemy, one that inhibits, restricts, oppresses, and aborts individual effort. To be sure, many continue to call for its reform and development, such as the Victorian writers, Carlyle, Dickens, Mill, Arnold, and others, but there is also an embedded realization that the task is tall and that one might not succeed. In fact, one theme in much of the literature was that of being stuck in a problematic social state and status that cannot be changed, and of a strong sense, not of determination, as in Romanticism or in some texts in the earlier phase, but of determinism. Who are the most important authors in England and America, and what are some of the major texts? There are so many, of course, but here are some of the most important by way of illustration. In the first phase, most 18th century authors and texts, in both verse and prose, can be considered realistic, addressing issues belonging to this world and of concern to the individual in a social state or context. On the English side, we suggest much of Alexander Pope's poetry, including an essay on man, Daniel Defoe's novels, and his important essay on the education of women, Jonathan Swift's novels and his ironic essay, A Modest Proposal, Staines's novels, including his most engaging, most creative novel, Tristram Shandy, Samuel Johnson's works, including The Vanity of Human Wishes, Thomas Gray's poems, including Elegy written in a country churchyard, Oliver Goldsmith's The Deserted Village, Samuel Richardson's works, including Clarissa, Henry Fielding's novels, including Joseph Andrews, Jane Austen's novels, such as Pride and Prejudice, Mary Estelle's Some Reflections Upon Marriage, and of course we have the works of Anne Radcliffe, Anne Barbauld, and Anne Finch as well. On the American side, there are Benjamin Franklin's works, such as his autobiography and his other important book, The Way to Wealth, D. Crevecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Thomas Jefferson's The Declaration of Independence, and Phyllis Wheatley's poems as well. In the second phase in England, we have Carlyle's works, including Past and Present, the novels of Dickens, such as Great Expectations, George Eliot's novels, such as Middlemarch, John Henry Newman's works, including The Idea of a University, Matthew Arnold's, including Culture and Anarchy, Oscar Wilde's plays, including The Importance of Being Earnest, and the works of John Ruskin, Elizabeth Browning, Robert Browning, the Rossettis, Dante and Christina, Walter Pater, Charles Darwin, Tennyson, John Stuart Mill, and many others. In America, there is Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, William Dean Howell's A Hazard of No Fortunes, Henry James's Daisy Miller, Kate Chopin's The Awakening, Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, Frank Norris's McTeague, Henry Adams' The Education of Henry Adams, Ambrose Bierce, An Occurrence, Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, and many more. What realism is in the English and American literary canon is clear by now. It is a literary movement that took place and dominated in two eras, as explained before. In the first era, that of the 18th century Enlightenment, it came as a reaction against or a departure from what prevailed before, for the purpose of prioritizing two elements that received little attention, relatively speaking: human society as a subject worthy of great attention and improvement, and the lives of common, ordinary individuals who do common but significant things. This is in opposition to heightened focus on the metaphysical world and individuals of higher and more noble status and deeds which prevailed before. In the second era, it came in its reaction against or departure from both romances and romanticism to focus on life in society, with its various complications, problems, and limitations, and the lives of common, ordinary protagonists who spend much of their lives fighting either losing battles against societal odds or those that do not bring about any significant achievement. This is oppositional to what happens in romances and romanticism, which focus either on heroes in the various frontiers or on life in nature, where common individuals are able to transform their lives and achieve elevation. Additionally, while in the first era there was paradoxically a level of romanticism or romanticization in realism, especially in relation to the endings of some texts, realism in the second phase is largely, almost exclusively, devoid of it, which means there are no romantic dimensions of any realistic plot in the second era. And hence the emphasis is on portraying lives of common, ordinary individuals as they are, no elevation, no transcendence, no meaningful achievement. And realism in both phases, one should remind, gave importance to and popularized, generically speaking, the novel and the short story in particular. One thing important to conclude with: not any story from real life is considered realistic, according especially to realism in the second phase. To qualify as realistic, texts have to be ones that mirror the lives of common, ordinary people who lead common, ordinary lives and who have common, ordinary endings. As many have emphasized, realism, especially in the second phase again, is generally hostile to happy endings. Those individuals in real life, whom you and I might know, whose stories appear exceptionally heroic, very successful, or grand, are considered romantic, not realistic. Realism in our context is a technical term denoting a literary school of thought with the established premises we have just presented.